everybody. I'm Momin. I am here from the Berkman Klein Center for Genetic and Society at Harvard. And as a couple of preliminary things, I'm not a philosopher. Actually, can I have a show of hands? How many people are based in a different discipline, partially or entirely? And how many people are based in philosophy, partially or entirely? Okay, so that's good. That's an interesting mix. My training is in two separate areas. The first was history of science, which was my undergrad, where I kind of had a frustration with philosophy of science for a long time because I thought it ignored empirical issues. And then I read Ian Hacking. I came across this wonderful book by Eric Winsberg, Science in the Age of Computer Simulation. And then I saw that what philosophy can be really powerful in doing is bringing clarity and precision. So I hope you will bear with me, because this is not going to be philosophically rigorous, but I hope you can give me some good suggestions. And my goal here is to really bring to the attention of philosophy and philosophers what I think are some critical issues that I would really, really love to see addressed from a philosophical perspective. Throughout, I will be talking about models, not algorithms. This is a separate paper I'm working on. I think that in almost every case, what we care about is the underlying logic, not the procedure, and the underlying logic will be of a statistical model. As soon as you start talking about models, you open up a whole area of inquiry that brings much more clarity than using this actors category that I think can be very sloppy. I also, unlike a philosopher, am not going to get into definitions, and that's partially because it's a very contentious area and I don't feel equipped to sort it out, but I will note that whether you're talking about interpretability or explainability, decision trees are definitely that. Whatever the definition is, decision trees are indeed an example. And so I'll be basing a lot of my critique around a specific decision tree that's based on this Titanic data set. So there's a whole online community based probably off the movie's hype that obsessively researches every person who was aboard the Titanic, and this has been compiled into a data set that's frequently used for machine learning tutorials. And the basic things that are put into the model is if somebody was likely to survive or not, based on their age, sex, passenger class, and fare. There are other things in the data set, but those are the things that are commonly used for illustrative purposes. Just to show you what that will look like, I'll have a bit more of a complicated model, but this is the model. The model is the idea that you can split data by different variables or covariates, and thereby partition the data. The actual algorithm that does it, there's a bunch. There's CART, there's C5.0, and then there's this really confusing line in Pedro Dominguez's book, Learning Algorithms, or Algorithms that Make Other Algorithms. Again, models are much more helpful. Once the decision tree is built, then data running through it is another sort of algorithm. I'll only be talking about the model and how it's splitting on, actually is one of these a laser pointer? Top one? No. Yeah, it's splitting on different variables, and if it's a continuous thing like fare, it splits on certain values of it, and at the end, it makes a prediction. And I'll also go into some of that. Okay, so the overview is, I'm going to argue that interpretability, or explainability, but interpretability seems to be the strong case, is the wrong conversation to be having. It's really about causality. I'm talking about causality in a statistical modeling sense, not in a philosophical sense. And I came out of Carnegie Mellon for my PhD, and I know the philosophy department there does both sides, but I do not know the philosophical side or how much that justifies the modeling side. But I'll talk more about that. And I'll argue that if we have a non-causal model, interpretability doesn't actually get us anything that we might care about or use. I'll introduce this idea of prediction policy problems, and I think that's what we need to really be thinking about for if we can ignore causality. And I'll lastly argue that it's really hard to show something is a prediction policy problem, and so maybe such problems don't actually exist in the real world, they're only hypothetical. This is the outline. You can also follow along on the pale left side. This URL is wrong, but if you want to download my slides, they are already uploaded at my name, mominmalik.com/IER 2019. At the end of the slides, I also have a draft of my paper attached, so you can check out the references there. The first thing I want to introduce is a really important historical background. Leo Breiman was a statistician who kind of crossed over into doing machine learning. He has this amazing article from 2001 called Statistical Modeling, the Two Cultures, that if you haven't read it and you work at all in machine learning, I think it's really, really crucial to read. He tells in his own biography that he first was in academia and then he left to be a consultant, and he consulted for the Department of Transportation, for the Environmental Protection Agency. Left out of that narrative, but now talked about by Matt Jones at Columbia, was extensive consulting he also did for the Department of Defense. And it's understandable that he left that out. And that played a huge role in the evolution of his thinking as well. But in this paper, he says that he spent these years as a consultant, and when he came back to academia, he was frustrated by how irrelevant academic statistics was for the kind of practices that he saw. And he said that there's this new type of modeling culture, what he called algorithmic modeling, that he said is mainly made up of young computer scientists in this subfield called machine learning. And he sort of made this challenge to statisticians that you're missing these really important problems because you care so much about the data generating process that you can't just make predictions. Because of that, you're missing out on important problems, and the implication was that they're going to be irrelevant, especially since that really proved prophetic, and statisticians saw themselves being eclipsed and outshadowed by machine learning and data science. It's a really biting critique to read. So that's the background, and he talks about the kind of prediction problems he worked on. One in particular is with court cases, and I'll be returning to that example before. He also talks about decision trees as an example of an interpretable model, and he says they rank an A+ for interpretability, a B for predictions, whereas something like random forests rate a D for interpretability, but an A+ for prediction. So even back then, he was already talking about interpretability and how that connects to use, although in a very casual, colloquial sense. The problem with explainable models. So explanations of models confuse explanations of the world, or are confused with explanations of the world. Cynthia Rudin and colleagues have a paper. So I'm using this because Cynthia Rudin also has a very strong critique against explainability, saying that what we need is interpretability, so teasing those two apart. Either way, decision trees succeed. You can turn them into a decision list that is both interpretable or explainable, whichever you care about. The paper is Lethan, Rudin et al. That contains the line, for example, we predict that a passenger is less likely to survive than not because he or she was in the third class. I think that can be rigorously read as a statement about the model. It's saying the model classifies them this way, but not the world is determining that they die because they are third class. And this confusion pops up again and again. There's a whole bunch of authors who have raised this, but it's usually just a single sentence in an otherwise long article. Finale Doshi-Velez, who's also affiliated with the Berkeley Klein Center, and Bean Kim can say, one can provide a feasible explanation that fails to correspond to a causal structure, exposing a potential concern. Rich Caruana, who's a researcher at Microsoft, has this very famous example of asthma being highly predictive of a lower chance of getting pneumonia. Very counterproductive. It's, of course, because people who have asthma get more care. So it ends up being a classic correlation-causation problem. He also says that in this paper, the models are intelligible, so it is tempting to interpret them causally. The models accurately explain the predictions they make. They are still based on correlation. Zachary Lipton also has a couple of different versions of the mythos of model interpretability. Interpretation might explain the behavior of a model, but does not give deep insight into the causal associations, which might be the real goal. The real goal might be to discover potentially causal associations that can guide interventions. I mentioned Leo Breiman, and I think in his paper from 2001, there's a great example of this. He presented to a group of Colorado judges a project he worked on the sources of delays in court cases. He made a big decision tree. He showed it on an overhead slide. One of the splits was on District N, which suggested that District N was responsible for large delays. He refrained from commenting, but as he walked out of the room, he's heard one judge say to another, I knew those guys in District N were dragging their feet. Is being District N, as putting on my statistician's hat, I would say, is it correlated with other variables like fewer resources, fewer personnel? That might be the actual causal explanation. What we really would care about before blaming District N is would other districts have had the same delay if given the same lack of resources? Before we blame District N for dragging their feet, i.e. something under their control, we would need to look at alternative explanations. But a decision tree is not doing that. It's splitting on whatever's optimal. And I'll give an example of that next. A decision tree for survival aboard the Titanic. So I haven't gone carefully into what we might want for interpretability, but 3 things that I think are fair is face validity as a way of checking the model. If your decision tree makes no sense, you might want to reject it on that basis. You might want to anticipate when the model might break down. So you say, okay, this doesn't correspond to a causal relationship, so maybe that won't generalize, maybe that won't hold. I might want to use domain knowledge to fine-tune the model, to challenge certain parts of the model and change it, and in theory, thereby improve it. And the first example I'll give, and I'll show the decision tree, it'll be very complicated. I have a bar graph for the number of people who lived on the top in red and who died on the bottom in black. I don't show percentages because I think it's helpful to see fewer and fewer people at each branch of the tree. So in the total training set, so data split into training and test, you have this many people who died, it's I think 500 something, and this many people who lived, which is 300 and something. If you split it along male and female, all of a sudden, if you make your prediction on the majority class, you have a much higher accuracy. And here, if you always predicted that females are going to survive, then again, you get a much higher accuracy. And you break down further and further. So here we have this very strange thing. Having a higher fare means you're more likely to have died. I would say that violates face validity. But if we switch to the test data, and I'll switch back and forth, so the test data, slightly different numbers. Overall, it's about half the size of the training set, but it holds. So again, people with that higher fare are still more likely to die in the held out data, which in theory will provide an idea of how well the model will generalize. As the converse, what if something has face validity? Can it fail to generalize? And here I'll give the opposite example of a lower fare, again being correlated with, a higher fare being correlated with living, so above 7.88 in whatever the currency is converted into. But in fact, in the test set, there are fewer people who died who had higher fares. And so that's, again, a way in which things correspond to intuition, but may not generalize. And lastly, we might think of using interpretations to fine-tune the model, and I would think of challenging a model or wanting to challenge predictions as being something maybe akin to this. There's a series of econometrics papers by Bruno Frey et al. That are cited in my work that try to causally model social factors like noblesse oblige, other women and children first norms. And what they do is they use a definition of children as 16 or younger. This is a contemporary definition from the United Nations, maybe not appropriate to read back into the direct panic data, but they do that, and in their model, they have their cutoff at 16 based on prior knowledge and domain knowledge, not on the data. So we might say, well, let's change that split to being at 16. If we do that, the model does worse. This is only the training data. Again, on the test data, it also does worse. So if we use domain knowledge to fine-tune the model, we're kind of going against what the model is trying to do, which is just split optimally on data. The problem with prediction. I've been using this word, and I think it has a lot of problems. One thing that I use to point this out is articles like this that say, predict the future. Well, why the future? What else would you predict? The past? And then you have this showing up in headlines, software predicts tomorrow's news by analyzing today's and yesterday's. But here it says predict the future, so that weird language shows up. There's this paper I really like by Daniel Gallo-Avello. The preprint is called I Wanted to Predict Elections with Twitter, and all I got was this lousy paper. He says all of these papers predicting elections with Twitter, it's not prediction at all. I have not found a single paper predicting a future result. All of them claim that a prediction could have been made, i.e. they are post hoc analysis, and needless to say, negative results are rare to find. There are a couple of things packed into this critique. One is that publication bias can mean that positive studies are going to be published, and all the studies that fail, we don't see them. So machine learning probably doesn't work nearly as well as we think from publication. The other is, it's kind of a critique of how the word prediction is used. In technical terms, a prediction is just the fitted value of a model. It says nothing about whether that's in the future or the past or held out data. But the problem is that that's then used by people themselves who are doing modeling and by reporters, by the public, to think about the future, to think about this prophetic ability. And I think that that can be very misleading. Predictions are correlations, and Zachary Lipton, from a different version of that paper, says, again, the real goal may be to discover potentially causal associations. But what's actually happening is that it's minimizing an error. There's some loss function and you're minimizing that. And that feat might be achieved in a purely correlative fashion. And in fact, if you just have a static data set, you're not getting new data that you're constantly testing against, that's what you're going to have. You're going to have post hoc correlations forming the basis of your predictions. Will they actually predict? Maybe, maybe not. You should really test it out on real out-of-sample data that you never had a chance to look at to know if it really does work. And there's some good examples of showing how machine learning might break down when you do that testing, such as in the parable of Google flu trends, which David Lazard here at Northeastern has, along with other Northeastern collaborators. I also want to point out that this use of prediction, this technical term, is not inevitable. If somebody has a better economist to cite for this, please tell me, but I did find Milton Friedman saying this. The purpose of what he wants economics to be is can be used to make correct predictions about the consequences of any change in circumstances. That's causality. So predicting under intervention means you have to know what's going to happen causally. Physicists I talk to who work with computer scientists find it really bizarre how people in machine learning use the word prediction, because for them, you're predicting the result of an experiment, some change in the world, not this passive error minimizing thing. There's a large literature, niche, but growing literature on causal inference or causal learning or causal discovery. They make the case to those algorithmic modelers, the people in machine learning, hey, even if you only care about prediction, if you know causal relationships, it'll help you predict more robustly under different changes in the underlying processes. So they've been making that argument for 40 plus years. Prediction versus causal explanation. So now that I've established that prediction is defined in a way that it contrasts with causality, we can take a look at the difference between the two. From Leo Breiman, we have the idea of these two distinct goals of modeling. He calls it models for prediction and models for information. There's an article I really like by Galachmelli, To Predict or to Explain, where she contrasts prediction and causal explanation. Sendil Mullainathan and colleagues, he's an econometrician who wrote some papers with people in machine learning. He first was calling these umbrella problems and brain dance problems, which is fanciful but also kind of insulting or primitivist. Later on, he calls these y-hat problems and beta-hat problems, which I like better. And if you know the language of statistical models, you want to have the outcome variable, y, is equal to some linear combination of weights and inputs. And so the weights are the beta hats, and the predicted values or the fitted values are the y hats. They are in competition. Galachmelli's article goes through the what is a bias variance trade-off and shows that under some circumstances you can show that a less true model will predict better than a more true model. And these are very operationalized definitions, and you can take a look at the paper for that. But this has been a paradox in statistics for a long time under Stein's paradox. The idea that if you make the model inaccurate in its individual terms, as a whole it can do better. I really like an example from Sendil's paper with Jan Spies, that very different sets of variables predict equally well, but have very different implications for intervening. They have this chart in their paper. So what this is they take the American Housing Survey, split it into 10 parts, and fit a feature selection model on each part. This is the lasso. So they find that in each section, very different sets of variables are selected into the model, but overall the predictions are very similar, and the predictive performance is very similar. So if all you care about is the outcome, the y-hat, then this is fine, you don't really care. But if you want to intervene on housing prices, know how you should invest, things like that, it might be much more important what's causing the changes in housing prices. In another paper, they come up with this term, prediction policy problems. It's hard to get a good definition of this. They have a lot of the mathematical formalism, but the idea is that you have some decision that depends only on the outcome. The decision you make is a function only of the outcome. So say, trying to equalize outcomes among different groups would not be a prediction policy problem, because you'd have to have one of the input variables as part of your decision. If these and other conditions hold, then you can use prediction, by which I think we should say correlations only, and you don't have to worry about causality. This paper is very similar to Leo Breiman's paper, although not citing it. It's saying big class of problems, policymakers or econometricians have ignored them. They're really important. Machine learning can do way better on them than the techniques they've been using. And so this is their kind of version of Leo Breiman's things that they formalize a bit more. The question that I am probably not equipped to answer, but I would like to point to, is can using correlations alone be just? And that's what I would really like to see more rigorous treatment of in terms of prediction policy problems. Some of the failure points I think we can consider. Counterfactual comparisons, I think, end up being claimed as prediction policy problems, but are really causal problems. If we intervene on the system, we could potentially change it. So if you have, an iBanking firm or a hedge fund that's making predictions about the stock market, but then buying large portions of it, it's changing the system, and they're not modeling how that change will take place. There was a philosophical paper I saw, I don't remember who by, was pointing out that what we need to know is not, will this intervention work? Will this intervention work in the world where this intervention exists? Which is a subtle difference, but it illustrates, I think, some of the flaws of thinking of predictions only. We don't think about how we intervene in the system. Intervening on covariates, like the American Housing Survey example, if what we want to do is intervene on parts of the system, then we really need to know causal relationships. Otherwise, we end up deprioritizing people with asthma for pneumonia treatment because, hey, it predicts lower risk. Gaming the system. Anytime you have a proxy and not the thing itself, and an incentive or some game to be had, people are going to game it. There's the McNamara fallacy, or the quantitative fallacy, which was Robert McNamara during the Vietnam War, caring only about body counts. Never verifying them, just saying what are the body counts today of the enemies, and people just started lying to him. And so proxies can be gamed. It shouldn't be possible to study for the SAT, but because it has a lot writing on it, people will try to game it and do things to improve your score. Negative feedback loops. So possibly there could be a positive feedback one, but I think the predictive policing one is an example that's frequently brought up. The more you focus on certain neighborhoods, the more you'll find those same neighborhoods having crime. And Christina Lum has a very nice version of this in a couple of papers. Unreliable metrics and data. I think a lot has been said about that, and I will not say more about that, but I think the previous talk also got into that. Probably other things that I haven't thought about. And this would be a really interesting thing to look. If we would want to challenge predictions, that's one clue that the problem might be causal. This is kind of a vague intuition I have, but I'd have to follow up and think about. So in that paper about prediction policy problems, they give these 5 examples that I'll go through and show I don't really buy any of these as prediction policy problems. Predicting the teachers will have the greatest value added. Labor market, predicting how long unemployment will last. Targeting health inspections for restaurants. Predicting highest risk youth for targeting interventions, and identifying underlying creditworthiness. First example, education, teacher with the greatest value added. So Kathy O'Neill has a very good critique, and that comes from a colleague of hers whose name I'm forgetting, of the value added model, about how it's a bad metric. It's very inconsistent from year to year, from subject to subject, class to class. So that kind of reveals how it's a proxy for the underlying goal of teacher quality or teacher efficacy. And if we optimize to the metric, we're not optimizing to the real underlying signal. What we really want to know is, will a given teacher do better at teaching a group of students, as opposed to a different teacher? I think that would be a causal problem. Unemployment spell length. So the purpose, they say, is to help workers decide on saving rates and job search strategies. Job search strategies would directly affect unemployment spell length. So again, you're modeling a system without modeling how you're intervening in it. And I think that, again, if the goal is kind of to not just react to the thing, but to change it, then again, it's a causal question and not a prediction policy problem. Targeting health inspections. They cite a paper of using Yelp reviews to find restaurants that may have unsanitary conditions. I would point out that there's a great paper coming out that refutes that goes back, reanalyzes the data and said, it selectively looked at the data. If you look at the entirety of the data, this is not actually working. This is due to Raid Ghani. I was one of the data science for social good fellows, and he always talks about, you don't actually care about finding the maximum number of violators. You want to have an inspection regime that encourages compliance. So it's not the finding things that are, it's the actual goal, it's the overall system. Think about a game theoretic approach, but I think all of these get more into, you can't just react to an outcome. You are intervening on the system. You are designing the system. Highest risk youth. I think here the goal is to decrease the risk, which risk itself is a model. I get really annoyed by people who say predict the risk, even though I've probably said it before. That means frequency of negative outcomes. I would say, are you really not intervening on anything that goes into the model? Like participation in after-school programs, like availability of a tutor. I would find that very incredulous, and as soon as you're intervening on the system, then it's not a prediction policy problem anymore. Lastly, underlying creditworthiness. So this is probably the best bad example of a causal problem treated as a prediction one. There's a lot of work that only now I'm discovering because I'm looking into some business and history literature about how credit scores like FICO are just based on correlations. They're one of the earliest examples of the massive use of a predictive model in industry, and they have had decades of really horrible edge case outcomes, not to mention systematic inequality. Some of the books that I found about this, or articles, Scorecards as Devices for Consumer Credit, Creditworthy takes this more directly in terms of looking at the consequences for society. And there's also an article on classification situations, life chances in the neoliberal era, where something like your credit score will determine how well you do in life. And so this is, in fact, a great example of why we shouldn't go with predictions only. We, first of all, maybe somebody's ability to pay back is not even worth looking at in isolation because of historical injustices, contextual factors, but even then, we shouldn't be using correlations for that. In another article, again by the same group of machine learning people in Sendhil Mullainathan, they have this big argument that bail decisions are a prediction policy problem. I think this still ultimately fails because, as Duncan really nicely pointed out, the literature about how there's no such thing as crime data. We either have arrest data or crime report data, which systematically kind of bias our estimates in one direction or another in ways that we can't just combine. So if we don't really know if somebody commits a crime, leaving aside the social construction of what's a crime, we're not really going to be able to use crime or arrest data to know if we've succeeded in our actual goal rather than succeeding in optimizing the metric. But if the data were accurate, if arrests and charges were fair, then the goal would be not having people commit crimes. So in that case, people couldn't game the system. If you game the system and don't commit a crime, then that's great. That's the outcome you want. It is a counterfactual comparison because would this person, if released, go on to commit a crime? But they have, why is this not working? They have a very sophisticated argument. They say this is a censored data problem. You wouldn't know what happened to the people previously observed who were not given bail if they would have been charged or arrested. Some of the statistics of this is that they find an instrumental variable, which is judge leniency. Some judges on average release more people, some people on average release fewer people. And they use that difference to do some statistical tricks and econometrics tricks to try to estimate how well this would work as a prediction policy problem and argue that we can release more people while keeping the same crime rate, or reduce the crime rate while incarcerating the same or denying the same number of people bail. Again, I think it doesn't work because of the data, but otherwise it would have worked. This was a really, really difficult argument. Andrew Gelman said that he realized econometricians go out looking for instrumental variables and then write studies around them. So it's not like you can find an instrument for whatever you might want to study. It's really happenstance. But that's what it should take. places where unjust use might be okay. And this gets into, again, trade-offs, and this is not something I'm, again, going to be qualified to speak about, but there's probably going to be an argument that it's less unjust than the status quo. I think Duncan also brought this up. Unequal distribution of lesser injustice might also be an injustice in itself. And I think if these systems get institutionalized, they can be harder to change, unlike human decision makers whose biases may be addressed. Maybe the unjust effects are minor. One of the data science for social good projects is about lead paint. And that the lead paint that's existed in the past is not being painted anymore. And there's still concerns about whose lead paint is addressed, but maybe there's an argument that the feedback loops are minor enough. And lastly, another project I really like is predicting adverse police interactions. So this is predictive policing for police. I'm totally fine with people in power being subjected to, undue or unjust scrutiny where they don't have the ability to get out of it. Maybe I should be concerned about fairness for everybody, but I think if the injustices fall on people who have incredible amounts of privilege, I'm far less concerned about it than falling on people who are not in power. This is not yet talking about a whole other series of critiques about this whole framework of modeling, this whole framework of causality. Sociologist Andrew Abbott has this fantastic article from 1988, Generalized Linear Reality, where he says this whole idea of observations and variables contradicts almost every major tradition in theoretical sociology. So all of statistics just does not agree with theoretical sociology, yet that's how all of our quantitative social science is done, because it's the language we have available. There's this great blog post, Your Demand for Statistical Proof is Racist, about how we deny people's experiences and preference data that we say, oh, that's subjective, a whole bunch of other things. So in conclusion, this is the same list I've shown before. I hope I have convinced you that causality, at least in the statistical sense, is the real issue, and we should be looking at the conditions under which we can use non-causal models like these prediction policy problems, and how we can determine if they really exist or if it's fair to use them. Thank you very much.
Okay, so great. So the boring thing is that I agree with almost everything in this paper, except I don't think it's pushed far enough. And if you push it further, I think there are some questions that begin to open up. So I'm basically going to do the thing that you said you're not qualified to do, but I don't agree that you're not qualified to do, which is take some of the core concepts, 3 in particular. The first is probe this relationship between predictive policy problems and the quote-unquote just use of machine learning. The second is to talk about causality a bit, because I think it's key and it's a concept that runs through the whole talk and the paper, and it's not always clear exactly what we mean by causality, and I think it's important. And then the third is to just have a look at a few other possible critiques of interpretability that relate to but are slightly different from the one that you're making in the paper. So the first thing is to probe the relationship, which is the core argument between prediction policy problems and the just use of machine learning. So you set up an interesting question, which is how do we know whether something is or is not a prediction policy problem? And you've got the 5 examples from the Kleinberg paper. To the social scientists, the first thing that I thought is whether something is a prediction policy problem is not so much a feature of the actual judgment that's being made itself, it's a choice. And this gets back to the idea that, and this is I thought about this in the creditworthy example, that when we set up problems as prediction policy problems, the world molds itself to their image. And this is like the story being told in the creditworthy book.
Yeah.
It actually changes the nature of the underlying practice so that the practice molds itself to become more amenable to a prediction policy problem. So that means we get to ask a question, which is about how we should make that choice. Rather than is it a prediction problem or not, then should we use it or not, it's how do we want to make the choice and what are the different considerations we might have as we make that choice. And so I'm going to offer a few thoughts about that that intersect with some of the arguments of your paper. So intuitively, when you're thinking about the just use of machine learning, there are 2 kinds of ways of thinking about it. One is in terms of outcomes, and there's a ton of things, but I'm just going to bracket that. And the other is roughly in line with the strand of thought of your paper, which is in terms of the judgment. And there's a certain kind of assumption here, which is that the structure of the judgment that's being made in machine learning should mirror or match in some way the structure of the judgment that we're required to make institutionally. or by the human, in other words. So jumping off your criminal justice example, you can distinguish between 4 types of judgments that you make in criminal justice. The first is bail, and as you say, by law, that is required to be a predictive judgment. We'll come back to that. The second is conviction. That's prohibited by law from being a predictive judgment. It has to not be a predictive judgment. It has to be about the individual case. So cool. The third is sentencing, and sentencing is interesting because it depends who you ask. Some people think it should be a predictive problem, and the prediction there is what best minimizes future possible crimes. That's the deterrence idea, basically. Other people think, no, a just sentence is one proportionate to the actual crime that's committed, and that's necessarily individual. And then other people think it's about public safety, which is kind of somewhere in the middle. And then the fourth is parole, which again is basically a predictive judgment, or thought by law to be. So here are 2 counterintuitive things that I think throw a bit of that into doubt, and then throw into doubt by implication the idea that what we should be doing here is looking for the nature of the judgment as we currently conceive it, and then matching whether or not to use machine learning based on that. So bail. Computer scientists love that because by law they've got a prediction problem. Happy days. Then you can use machine learning and you shouldn't have any problems because that's what judges are doing. There are a couple of recent really good pieces on this point out, and this is an old idea in jurisprudence, actually, that even though by law a judge might be required to be making a predictive judgment, actually there are a ton of different things that judges are actually doing when they're making that judgment. Part of this is sometimes they just don't make a predictive judgment, and you could say, well, they should be, but that is a question. And part of it is that what they mean, or what they take to a predictive judgment to be, is so varied. And that idea of judicial discretion is extremely important, even when the judgment is itself predictive. So even though you might think, and I agree with your judgment about this case, that even though you might think that's a pretty clear example of a prediction policy problem, there are very good reasons for thinking that prediction is not actually what's going on, and that there are costs to using a sort of locked-in form of prediction. But I don't think that means we shouldn't necessarily do it. And then the second one is conviction. I think the conviction case is interesting, particularly in juries, because it pops up the question, why do we think it's wrong to predict judgments of conviction? And I think the answer to that is not because it's not a prediction problem. I think the answer to that is because the process, juries are legitimate fundamentally because you're being judged by your peers. Juries are not legitimate fundamentally because they get it right. And that tells you something about how we think of the importance of the underlying judgment and matching it to the choice about whether or not to use machine learning, I think. So I think there are 4 questions rather than 1. The first is the one you pose, which is whether or not to use machine learning. But the second is then how to set up the problem. What kind of judgment do we want to assume that we're going to make and then use in terms of machine learning? And these are this is why the 4 different kinds of judgments in criminal justice I think are useful. And then the third is, once we've decided to use machine learning and set up the problem in a certain kind of way, how do we choose the outcome of interest, choose the training data set and label it, and pick the features so as to match that kind of judgment? Because there are loads of different ways of doing those things that basically imply different kinds of judgments. And then fourth, and possibly most importantly, given the way that we've decided to set up the judgment, how do you want to combine it with human judgment? So all of this is to say that I think 3 conclusions follow from your argument that I'm not sure, I think 3 things are true, and I'm not sure how exactly your argument intersects with them, and I'd be interested to know what you think. The first is that something not being a prediction problem, I don't think is a sufficient condition for it being unjust to use machine learning. The second is that something being a prediction problem, I don't think is a sufficient condition for it being just to use machine learning, and I think you agree about that one.
Yeah.
And then the third one, and this is where I think we disagree, is that a judgment being a prediction policy problem, I don't even think is a necessary condition for the just use of machine learning, because I think that depends on prior questions about whether you should, how you set up the problem, which is a kind of choice. If that makes sense.
What's the difference between your first and your third?
The first is just a negative, in a way.
Okay.
There are cases that will be covered by the first, it's not by the third. But the first is a negative. Something not being a prediction policy problem is not a sufficient condition for it being unjust to use machine learning.
Yes, I think I actually do agree with you on all 3 of those points. And partially it might come down to a weighting decision. And I don't know exactly how to express that, but it might be that There's some procedural injustice, and again, this is something I don't know how to talk about, but the procedural injustice is outweighed by a material justice or something like that. So I think it does depend on a lot more than just the problem type. But I hope at least that shifting away from interpretability as kind of anything relevant is what I managed to do here, even if I'm not clear on the rest of the things. Another thing you said that I do want to also second and agree with is, so this is known, I think, as the performativity critique, that I would love to see this pushed more firmly for machine learning. So this was first from sociology to economics. Things like the Black-Scholes equation don't reflect the world, but they create a structure that shapes the world to conform to the logic of the model. As soon as people start using this equation for setting policy, for making investments, you can see how it directly, makes itself true. It's hard to show this in a convincing way, kind of empirically in a lot of cases, but I think there definitely are places where you could and should show this for machine learning. And I think what you're alluding to with credit decisions and creditworthiness is definitely that. It's a decision was made to treat something as a prediction policy problem with ramifications that I think include a lot of injustices. And so in some sense, nothing is or isn't a prediction policy problem, but for how it's constructed. And yes, and the question should be, how should we decide on how we're using models to impose certain structures on the world?
And I think, to me, your argument at that point that interpretability should not be a major criterion is completely convincing. And just one thought on that. I've just recently, this is completely unrelated and I want to know what you think because I've got you. The concept of concept drift in the computer science literature seems to me a version of the performativity critique. In other words, that they've been thinking about it at Facebook. When you make predictions that change your underlying data, because it's a kind of internal, almost the whole of the data is, at least like a good chunk of the data that you have, is the result of prior, predictions or classifications or rankings. And so the thing that you thought you were doing is no longer what you're actually doing. That seems to, I don't know if that might be completely wrong.
Yeah, that is a good point. And
Yesterday's thought.
So I have a paper from 2016 where I try to apply performativity to Facebook's People You May Know. And Kieran Healy, who's a sociologist at Duke, has a paper I found after I wrote my own where he says Facebook's People You May Know might be a great example of a model making itself true. And in that, the people I talked to said there's a kind of, within companies, there's a kind of myopia around KPIs, key product indicators, that people in one part of the company have no idea what people in other parts of the company are doing. And so there's this mishmash of different things being optimized in different silos. So that's an interesting formalization. I think it probably maps more onto causality than any recognition of construction or the social construction of the reality that exists on models or on platforms. But that could be a way to open it up.
Well, that conveniently takes me on to causality.
Yeah.
So I'm in general a real skeptic about, last point, that's fine, about what people mean when they invoke concepts of causality. And I think machine learning is a fascinating way of prompting ourselves to answer that question. So just briefly on that, if you think about what an economist does, which is they play around with a data set, they see some correlations, they come up with a model, they present their model to an audience of educated people and they go, this is what I think is going on, or these are the factors that I think are driving the outcome. And then maybe they put numbers in it to offer a prediction, but they're really not interested in that.
Yeah.
But they pre-specify the model.
Yeah.
Whereas a computer scientist does not do that. They pre-specify the thing that they want to do, and then the patterns and structures they find in the data set. The idea always was, and I think one thing I think would be worth doing is just reading the Milton, Friedman, Hayek debate from the 30s and 40s, because they were arguing about exactly this point, pretty much. Friedman's view of economics, I mean, it's like no one believes it anymore, but it's basically a sort of predictive enterprise, and that's how you should evaluate, the actual validity of the model. He thinks is a predictive question. Hayek thinks But it was always a weird idea that we thought, when we put up our, 5-variable linear model, that we're telling a causal story in a useful sense. What we're really doing is capturing the kind of general tendencies of some phenomena in the social science, but our model will A, always have missing variables, and B, the data sets themselves will always be in some way incomplete. And that is a kind of hard limit to the extent to which we can ever really think we're telling causal stories. And I think probing that question a bit is quite important for the idea that there's a relationship between causality and whether or not you should use the model. Because he would say, in some sense, all problems are causal. It's all about the level of description, it's all about what question you're trying to answer. And so whether or not causation is sort of analytically a useful way of distinguishing between different types of problems, I think will depend on what idea of causality you're kind of getting at.
Yeah, so one argument that Leo Breiman makes in his paper is kind of causality is so hard that sometimes prediction is the thing to do. And that's, in some sense, a humble argument, but in some sense that ends up being even more arrogant, that we don't need to care about how the world works, we can still act on it. I didn't know about that debate. I'm gonna have to go back and look at that. But I think I've also come across some philosophy work. Anna Alexandrova, I think, from University of Cambridge, has a nice paper about explainability and explanations in kind of Gallup-Schneller's sense of do economic models actually explain, and no, or what does that even mean? So that's literature I would like to tap into, and that debate is a good thing to look up. But also if there's anything similar about what is a prediction, is a prediction even ontologically, epistemically possible, that sort of thing. I'd love to be pointed to that if there's anything. But